Hi, my name is Nathan and I'm a developer advocate at Conveyor. In this video, we will explore together a typical project you can build with Conveyor. This will give us the opportunity to walk through the Conveyor most exciting feature helping you in the day-to-day management of your data project, from experimentation to scaling and monitoring. Conveyor purpose is to streamline your workflow while working on data products. But what exactly is that workflow? Let's have a look together with an example. What we'll do in this project is to use the typical Titanic data set used often to do every kind of proof of concept. So the goal of this data set is basically to predict whether or not a passenger, given his or her features, would have survived the sinking of the ship. How does that look like data-wise? Well, it's quite simple. So we have a trained data set with a bunch of columns. In this case, we would extract the target feature, which is dying or not, like dead or not, with the feature columns, which are stuff like the age, profession, the ticket number, right? Various feature about the passengers. Then, with those features in target, we will train a classifier model that we will evaluate with a test dataset. The test dataset will produce some prediction that, like feeding the test dataset into the classifier, will produce some predictions that will allow us to evaluate the quality of our model. The first thing you want to do most of the time when you work on a data project is to explore the data. With Conveyor, you can easily deploy a Jupyter notebook that will be hosted directly in the Conveyor cluster, which means that you will enjoy in that Jupyter notebook the same level of access that your Conveyor project will have when running at scale, as well as enjoying the compute power of Conveyor directly. So you will have the same level of access and the same compute power than your production jobs. With this kind of access, we can easily explore the data and run a proof of concept of our modeling project. Then it's time for productionalizing our model. So we want to extract all our code from those notebooks. Hopefully, the synchronization between those notebooks running in Conveyor clusters and your IDE and your local project are very transparent, so it will be easy for you to extract those code. And then if you productionize your code, which is, for example, to make a clear standalone project out of it, and then write some tests for testing your different method, as well as building everything into a container using a Docker file in order to make that deterministic. When you have done like all those steps, you have a project which is standalone and like running easily locally. What you can do with that is you can use Conveyor Run. Conveyor Run will allow you to run the project like if it was locally, so directly in your IDE or directly in your terminal, except that the container will effectively run directly on the distant cluster, which is fairly cool because it gives you like the feeling of developing locally while you can directly test if your project is well running on that distant cluster that is Conveyor. Once you're happy with your project, it runs well with Conveyor Run. You see that it works. What you can do is to deploy your project. What you will need to do so is an Airflow DAG, so a graph that will tell which steps needs to run before each steps and so on. When you will have that DAG, which is just a kind of a scheduling, you can simply run Conveyor build to build your project and ship the image, as well as running Conveyor deploy for deploying your project in a given environment. If you are happy with your project running in that given environment, for example, in an environment named dev, you can simply promote your project to another environment like production using Conveyor Promote. When your project will be running, you probably want to monitor it and see how it's going. You can do that easily with Conveyor using directly the Airflow UI embedded in the Conveyor UI. You can also view and search all the logs of your application, as well as inspect the metrics collected by Conveyor for you. If something is going wrong, you can also activate some notification by email. When it's time to scale your project and make it reusable or scale in terms of better volume, you have basically two dimensions for scaling. The first one is the technical dimension, which will allow you, thanks to the fact that Conveyor is running on the managed Kubernetes server, to easily auto-scale that server and pick various kind of instances, providing you different kind of compute power and memory and CPUs and all those things. Conveyor also have a very in-depth Spark integration, which allow you to scale to big data volume if required. The second dimension of scaling is the organizational dimension, where you can easily fit Conveyor into your organizational landscape by using features like single sign-on, for example. In order to don't allow everyone to access all the project in your Conveyor environment, you can also use the role-based access control feature that will allow you to segregate who access to which project. Finally, Conveyor integrates a very transparent and clear overview of the cost. So you can also monitor that, and you can finally have enjoy some customizable templates for your colleagues to start directly from some easy to use code. So it's now time to see that in action directly in the Conveyor UI. The first time you will connect with the Conveyor UI, you will be welcomed by this very convenient guided tour. This guided tour is in two parts. The first part is showing you the different concepts around Conveyor, stuff like environments, projects, settings, notebooks, and so on. While the second part is all about deploying your first project in Conveyor through an example project. What we're going to do is this video now is that we will follow the first part of the guided tour about the concept, because it's a good illustration for me to explain you what is inside Conveyor, where we will go on our own for the deployment of the project part. So first concept important to understand is that you can interact with conveyors mainly in two ways, either the CLI using the terminal or using the UI directly. The thing is that you cannot do every action on both by both medium. So for everything related to the development, the orchestration, and the deployment of your project, you will privilege to use the CLI, where for everything regarding documentation, monitoring, and management of your project, you can do that with the Conveyor UI. So of course, something we want to do is to install the Conveyor CLI in your computer. To do so, we have some instructions that you can find here, and that will guide you in installing the CLI. In this case, you find an instruction about Mac, Linux, and Windows. Make sure that in both cases you have Docker installed, because Conveyor heavily rely on Docker under the hood. In my case, I already have that CLI installed, so I won't reinstall it again. But if you want to have a look at what it looks like, you can, for example, try here Conveyor in your terminal, and you can see that it effectively returns some comments that you can use. Then what you would like to do also is to authenticate with your cluster. So you will have to run the first time Conveyor auth login, so you can be connected with your Conveyor cluster. That will open here a login page where you may have to pause to input your password. But in my case, it was already done, so all good. Once you have your CLI installed, it's time for understanding the different concepts behind Conveyor. The first concept, which is really important, is the concept of environment. So an environment is the place where your project lives. It's the place where you deploy your project. In this case, most of the time you will match environment with the different tiers of your software delivery lifecycle. Something like a test environment, a prod environment, and an acceptance environment, or depending on how you work. You can also have an environment for your own. So you can have an environment where you work and where you deploy project without interfering with other project running, which would be your organizational project. Something very specific about environments is that every environment has its own Airflow server. So Airflow is an orchestrator that allows you to define how your data pipeline will be scheduled, when it will run, and what are the different tasks or steps that compose it. By defining an Airflow DAG, which is a directly acyclic graph, so just a graph defining what are the dependencies in your pipeline, which steps depends on each other. By defining such a graph, you are able to schedule your job in your environment. So that leads me to the next concept, which is the project. So a project in Conveyor is clearly your code. It's your entity, which is your code, which is made of your business logic. And it's basically made of three components. The first one being your source code. It can be some Python, some Spark, some Scala, some DBT code, whatever. For the fact that you can containerize it. So the second element of a project is a Docker file. So you need to be able to containerize your workflow in order to run it somewhere, in this case on Conveyor. And then the third element of your project will be your DAG. So a DAG saying when you want to run a specific project, when you want to run a specific job, written in Scala, written in Spark, whatever, but written in Python, but you need to define a DAG clearly that says when you run what. So in this case, three elements: your code, a Docker file building a container of your code, and a DAG saying when to run that code. Once that's done, the management of your project is quite simple. You just have to run Conveyor project build in order to build and ship your project to Conveyor clusters. And then once your project is there, you can just run Conveyor deploy henf dev or henf prod or whatever you name you have in order to deploy your project to that given environment. Something which is also very convenient for experimentation and prototyping of your data pipelines are notebooks. So Conveyor supports the run of notebooks directly in your Conveyor instance. So you can explore your data sources exactly with the same level of privilege and compute power that your Conveyor cluster would have. That's pretty convenient when you want to explore, for example, a data lake, or you want to start prototyping your data pipeline simply. Once done, you can always use those notebooks to extract code and write a production grade data pipeline. But you can do all the exploration at scale directly in Conveyor. Then Conveyor is a product that exposes cost in a very transparent way. So in the cost section, you can clearly identify which are the most expensive projects, why, and you can have a look at, simply what is driving your cost in your Conveyor environment. You then have some settings where you can work with your organization, define some role-based access control. You can also manage who are the users and various pure management tasks. And finally, we have the documentation where you can get started with all the Conveyor principles, find more information about the get started, some how-tos, technical reference, and so on. So now it's time for that. So now you have all the concept that you need for understanding Conveyor. what we want to do now is to create and deploy a project. We want to follow that workflow made of multiple steps from prototyping to development and scaling. And we will do that just now with an example project. So this is the part where we will basically stop this guided tour, but we will follow exactly the same step. So the first thing we want to do in this case is to deploy an environment. So in environment, we can simply create an environment. We can do that with the UI and name one environment like dev here, but we can also do that in the CLI. So if I want to do it in the CLI, I will run conveyor environment create dash name, and I will create a second environment that I will name prod. So that will be easy for me to have two environments. I will start by deploying in dev, and then I will promote to production when everything will be running. Prod, and then I will just add the wait flag so I can see it. I won't use the wait flag. There we go. So there I have created my environment directly in the CLI. So those are the two ways for you to create your environments. Now, if I go back to my UI and I refresh, you can see that we have the two environments ready there, the dev and the prod environment. Now, if we go into, for example, the dev environment and we click on it, we will be able to see the Airflow server running. So here you can see that we have, so this is like our conveyor environment, and then we have this Airflow server directly visible in our environment. That's the place where our DAG will appear when we will deploy our project to Conveyor. In an environment, we can see multiple things like what are our DAGs, what are the tasks that have been executed in our environment, if we have some streaming application, what are the notebooks running in our environment, and what are the deployment. So what are the projects deployed currently in our environment. So once we have those two environments deployed, we can now have a look at how we can deploy a project. So to do so, we have an example repository made of various projects that you can find on GitHub. If you look, I did it here. So it's on github.com datamindedbe conveyor samples.git. I already cloned that, so I don't need to do it again. So here you see that I already have those conveyor samples. And what we are doing is that you go into the Titanic example. So going into this, there we go. And that's basically our project. In order to manipulate it in a bit more convenient way, let's just open that in Visual Studio Code, which is my IDE. There we go. I will clear this, and I will clear this too. So in this case, this is like a regular conveyor project. So this is what a regular conveyor project will look like. And if you are familiar with Python projects, generally speaking, you won't be very you won't find that very exotic, right? So it's everything you can expect from a Python project made of source code with some jobs and some Python scripts with some requirements, some Python requirements which are defined here, as well as a README, a setup.py for the installation of the package. But we also find stuff like a Docker file that defines our runtime, and notebooks for explorations that we can open, like which are pure Jupyter notebooks. And finally, a DAG folder where we define our Airflow DAG. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to create our project and make our project visible in Conveyor so that we can interact and use Conveyor for running some comments. So we can do that easily with Conveyor project, create, and pass the name flag with, in this case, we will name our project samples Titanic, and I will add the Oh, I cannot do the weight in this case. There we go. So we just created the project. And if we go back to our environment and we go to project now, there we go. We can already see that that project has been created. For the moment, it's empty. Like we don't have any task execution, nor streaming application, notebooks, deployment, whatever. It's really an empty nut for now. What we want to do now is to start again our 101 workflow with Conveyor. So if you remember well, the classic life cycle of a data project is to start with an ID. We have that ID. We saw that in the first part of the video. But after that, we want to experiment. So we want a proper way to run our notebooks, explore data sources, build a prototype of our model, validate data, whatever we would like to do. Then we will try to build our code. So once we are happy with our notebooks, we want to extract the code out of the notebooks and build production grade code. In this case, this is those source code that you have here. So we started from the notebook and then we moved those to the source code here, which have the big advantage that they can be packaged. Those code can be tested, unit tested. And finally, we can package those jobs directly into a Docker file, so running them into a Docker image. What we want to do with this afterward will be to test them at scale using Conveyor Run. Conveyor Run will help us to run those jobs, those DAGs, directly in our IDE, but running on Conveyor. That has the massive advantage that you can iterate and you can prototype in the comfort of your IDE locally, but with the illusion that your code is running locally while it's actually running at scale with the right compute power, with the right level of privilege. So Conveyor Run in this case is really a big enabler for prototyping Spark jobs or data pipeline at scale. And finally, we will go into the next steps where we can deploy our projects and promote our projects. In this case, deploy to dev and then promote to prod, to then see how we can run that and how we can simply scale it also to bigger use cases. So first step is, in this case, to run a notebook. And well, it's quite simple because I just need my terminal to do so. And I can just run conveyor notebook create. And that will ask me on which environment I want to create my notebook. In this case, let's create it in dev. It will start progressing. And this will start deploying a notebook instance in my conveyor cluster. There, at the end, I will get a URL that I can click on, and that will bring me to the Jupyter Lab instance. This can take a bit of time for the first run when you run that on a new instance, simply because it needs to pull a bunch of images and you need to prepare a bit the ground for you. So let's make a pause now and start again in a few minutes when that will be ready for us to work. So after a while, 6 minutes in this case, it took a bit of time because this was the first run on the environment, but then your Docker caching will kick off and speed up the whole process. So after those 6 minutes, the notebook is now available at this address. You can click on it, but in my case, it also directly opened the Jupyter Lab in my web browser. So what you are able to find in this Jupyter Lab is exactly the same code as you had in your IDE, in your project. You can find your source code with your basic Python package, so you can already start prototyping from there if you want to. But you also and mainly find your notebooks. And this is where the magic happened, because there I can already directly start running those notebooks and enjoy the power of Conveyor, but also the same level of accesses to S3 buckets or whatever data sources that you are using. So here you see that I can run all my pre-processing and start playing with my data. You can basically do that with all your code and yeah, just prototype your whole project. Now, when it's done, so when you're done with this step of using some notebooks for prototyping, what you will want to do is to start building your project. So you want to start creating some production grade code that will be used in your jobs, in your Airflow DAGs. So in this case, you can see that we already wrote that code here, where you have some different jobs and some Python code, which is made of it with some function in it and some steps that it takes to make the project a reality. For example, you can see that you still find a match between what were the notebook, like exploration, model validation, with what are the jobs. So when we have defined this code and we are happy with it, we can also make it more production ready by writing some unit test, whatever are your guidelines there. But then it's important to, with those jobs, to link them in a DAG. So in your DAG, in this case, we define a DAG, which is called Titanic, and this is an Airflow DAG. So in this DAG, you can find that we defined a DAG made of various tasks, various steps: prepare, train, evaluate. You see that we define all the steps. Each of these steps are actually a conveyor container operator. So it means that Airflow will specifically run a container, and that container in this case takes some arguments and it will run. So it will run a container. Which container? The container that you have defined in your Docker file, and it will take some argument, in this case those, and you can see that we are running the different jobs that we define in our code. So we are running the different jobs that we prepared here. So that's pretty cool. It means that we moved from a notebook to a data pipeline with different steps that are organized between each other with some dependencies, and that we can run directly, and we can run on a schedule in a very production ready way. So at this point, we could directly say that we want to move to the next step, which is the deployment and the promotion of our project. But if we still want to deploy, and if we still want to develop our project, what can we do? Well, we can of course run the job locally in our own environment directly. That would work, but probably we don't have the same level of access and the same compute power as Conveyor. So this is why the Conveyor run command has been created for. So Conveyor run allow you to run your command, your DAG at scale directly in Conveyor, but all the logs and everything is bring back directly to your terminal. So you have the illusion that it's happening locally. You have the illusion that it's happening directly in the comfort of your IDE, which makes prototyping very convenient and efficient that way. So let's try to just run use Conveyor run with our DAG to see how that goes. So we can run this command where we'll say Conveyor run in which environment in dev, which with DAG, this DAG. What is interesting here, and that you can note, is that we haven't deployed or built anything yet. We will really just take this current state of the code, push it to the cloud and running directly and get the feedback out of it. So let's try it. So by starting this, you can see that it starts by building the image. So it will start by building the Docker file image here that we defined for our project. It builds it, and then it starts pushing directly the container image to Conveyor, so that Conveyor has the code that it needs in order to just do the run. Here, it's still a bit slow because, again, it's the first time we run that. The second time, third time you will run, that process will be way quicker because Docker caching will happen at that time. So now that the image has been pushed for the first time, we are prompted to choose for a specific task in our DAG to run. So we can choose which task we want to run directly. So let's say that we want to run the train task. the application becomes pending, and you can see that directly we get the application running and we get some logs directly out of the application. This could seem to be running locally, but it isn't. It's running directly in Conveyor. And I can prove it by showing you that, for example, if you go into your environment in dev, you can look at task executions and you can see that, yes, indeed, we just triggered manually a conveyor run project here. And this is logged, and this actually happened directly in the cluster. There we go. And we can do that for other tasks if we want to. So in this case, you'll see that it's getting way quicker now. It's the second time that it's running. There we go. We can run another process like the preparation of the data, for example, where you see that, okay, our whole process is working well. We can check like the input and output data streams, data bucket, and see like if everything has been processed as expected. So that's basically it. With this process, so with the whole usage of Conveyor Run, we can really streamline the way we develop application and the way we build those production grade pipeline. Now we are actually ready to deploy our project. So for deploying our project, it's really simple. We just need to run conveyor project build. That's the first step. This first step will build our image and push it to the repository. It will also detect what are the different DAGs in our process, and it will just make the code available to Conveyor. And then once Conveyor build is run, we can run Conveyor project deploy and give an environment, in this case dev, and we will wait for the deployment to be done. So now the deployment has started in the dev environment, and directly once this progress bar will be complete, we can go to the Conveyor UI and see our deployment succeeded. So now if we look at the Conveyor environment, and if we look at Conveyor, we take our environment, we log the DAG, and you can see that we now can find our DAG in the Airflow server. So it's actually even running. So if we click on this DAG, you can see that we now have an execution which is ongoing and running. So it's still maybe pending because it's queued, so it will be running very soon. So our process is actually deployed and ready to run. We can wait for a few seconds for everything to run and then move to promotion and other topics. There we go. So after a few minutes, you can see that our whole DAG successfully ran and that it completed successfully in our dev environment. So that means that we are actually quite happy with the results. And we checked all the input, outputs, and everything. So now it's probably time to move that project from dev to prod and promote it to the right environment. So as you can see, prod is still empty from every project, but hopefully we have an easy comment in Conveyor for us to do the promotion. So we can use Conveyor promote projects promote, and then we can say from which environment we want to promote to which environment, so from dev to prod in this case, and we can wait for it to happen. So let's start the promotion, and once this progress bar is done, you will be able to find our project in the prod environment. This is typically a task that you will coordinate with a CI/CD pipeline. So you will typically put your promotion comment just after a manual approval, for example, in your CI/CD pipeline, when you can say can we approve the deployment to prod? Yes or no. You click on the button saying yes, and then the Conveyor Promote commands is run and move a project from one place to another. Yeah, so there we go. So now, as you can see, we also have our project available directly in prod. And we also complete it, and you can see that it's currently running. So that's basically it. In this video, we have explored together everything you need to do in order to develop, build, and deploy and run your project. We move from this building step to the promotion step, the deployment and the building step, and then finally to this step above where we are able to run and to diagnose our projects easily by simply going to an environment and having an overlook at how our DAGs are behaving, how are things happening. We are able to look at the metrics, to look at the logs, and also send us notification if things are going wrong. So this video showed you like the really 101 workflow of promoting a data product from ID to scalable and running at scale data products. So I hope it was useful, and don't hesitate to request your Conveyor cluster right now and start building data products. Take care.